Picture this. You are walking down one of the oldest streets in America. The air is thick, not just with humidity, but with something older. Spanish moss hangs like curtains from the live oaks. The cobblestones underneath your feet were laid by hands that history mostly forgot. And lining both sides of the street are these houses, tall, elegant, painted in soft yellows and dusty pinks and faded greens, that do something no other house in America does. They turn away from you. Not rudely, not randomly. Every single one of them presents its narrow end to the street, a sliver of a facade, sometimes just one window wide, and then stretches back, long and deep, into the lot behind it. The real face of the house, the grand porch, the stacked verandas, the doorway, all of it faces sideways, into the garden, away from the world. And if you're like most people walking through Charleston, South Carolina for the first time, you notice this, and then you move on. You take a photo, you think charming, you think historic, you buy the sweet tea and keep walking. But here is what nobody on the tour bus tells you. That sideways turn was never just about charm. There is a real answer to why this house faces the way it does, and it has almost nothing to do with what the tour guide told you. By the end of this, you will not be able to look at it the same way again. Welcome to the Charleston single house. 1 room wide, 2 or more rooms deep, a porch. They call it a piazza here, not a porch, and the difference matters. Running the full length of the building on the side, stacked 2 or 3 stories high, catching every breath of wind that drifts in off the harbor. The door opens onto that piazza, not onto the street. You do not enter a Charleston single house from the front. You enter from the side, like a guest who already knows the rules. Architects have been studying this form for over 2 centuries. Historians have written dissertations about it. Preservationists have spent fortunes saving it. And tourists flood into the historic district every single year to photograph it, generating over $8 billion annually for a city that is, in many ways, built on the aesthetic of a very specific kind of suffering that it has never fully reckoned with. But let us start with the simpler question, the one that hooks you on the street before you even know what you are looking at. Why does it face sideways? Ask 10 people in Charleston, and you will get 10 different answers. The most popular one, the one the tour guides love, the one that gets repeated in travel magazines and architecture blogs and YouTube comment sections, is the tax story. The legend goes like this. In the colonial era, property taxes were assessed based on how wide your house's facade was on the street. So clever Charleston builders simply rotated their houses 90 degrees. One narrow end to the street, the whole house stretching back behind it, and suddenly you are paying tax on 18 feet instead of 60. Genius, right? It is a great story. It is the kind of story that makes history feel like a heist, and it is, at best, only partially true. No historian has produced a colonial-era Charleston ordinance that taxed street frontage. The documents that would prove this theory definitively do not seem to exist. What we have instead is a story that got repeated so many times it calcified into fact, the way legends do when they are more satisfying than the complicated truth. The complicated truth is more interesting anyway. The actual reasons the house faces sideways have nothing to do with outsmarting a tax collector. They have everything to do with land, heat, and money, and with who was doing the work that made all of it possible. Now, before you can understand why this house exists, you need to know what it actually looks like from the inside out. Walk past one quickly and you might miss it. That is the thing about the Charleston single house. It does not announce itself the way a Victorian mansion does, or demand attention like a Greek revival courthouse with its columns marching across a wide facade. It is subtle, restrained, almost modest at first glance, a narrow sliver of a building pressed against the street, one window wide on the front, maybe 2 stories, maybe 3, painted in some color that the Architectural Review Board approved after 3 rounds of deliberation. But once someone shows you what to look for, you will never walk past one without recognizing it again. The first rule, 1 room wide. Everything starts here. A Charleston single house is, by definition, 1 room wide. Not 1 room on each side of a hallway. 1 room. Full stop. Running the entire width of the building. That width is typically between 18 and 28 feet, and this single-room width is not a limitation that the builders worked around. It is the organizing principle from which everything else follows. It is the first decision, and every other decision flows from it like water finding its level. 2 rooms deep, at minimum. The house does not grow outward, it grows backward into the lot, like a sentence that keeps adding clauses. The piazza. This is not a porch. Call it a porch in front of the wrong Charlestonian, and you will know about it. The piazza, the word comes from Italian, borrowed through the same Caribbean architectural traditions that shaped so much of this city, is the defining exterior feature of the single house. It runs the full length of the building on the long side, typically the south or southwest face, positioned to catch the prevailing harbor winds. It can be 1 story. More often, it is 2. In the grandest examples, 3 stories of stacked piazza, each level slightly different in its detailing, each one a separate outdoor room for a different floor of the house. The structural logic is elegant. The piazza columns carry the weight of the floors above while simultaneously shading the exterior wall of the house from direct sunlight. In a building with no insulation, no HVAC, and walls that absorb and radiate heat like a slow oven, this shading is not decorative. It is the difference between a habitable interior and an uninhabitable one. On a still August afternoon in Charleston, when the air in the street has gone completely dead and thick, the piazza on the southwest face of a single house is still moving. Just barely, just enough. That is what it was designed to do. The door that opens sideways. The front door of a Charleston single house does not face the street. The real entrance opens onto the piazza. You approach the house from the street, pass through a small gate in the garden wall or fence, walk along the side of the building, and enter through a door that faces the garden, not the road. What faces the street is a smaller door, set into the narrow end facade that does not lead into the house. It leads onto the piazza. You enter through it, turn, and then enter the house properly from the side. This is not quirky. This is not an accident of incremental renovation. This is an intentional design choice that tells you exactly how these houses understood the relationship between public space and private life. The street was not trusted. The street was where commerce happened, where strangers passed, where the city's chaos moved. The piazza was the threshold, a controlled, semi-private space where you could be seen and assessed before being admitted inside. The house is not hiding from the street. It is simply refusing to be entered casually. The interior, hierarchy in every room. Step through that piazza door, and the floor plan reveals itself immediately. 2 rooms stacked front to back on the main floor. The front room, facing the street end, is the formal parlor. This is the public room, the performance space, the room where the household presented its best version of itself to visitors. High ceilings, the best plasterwork, the finest fireplace mantel, the furniture arranged for social display. The back room is more private, a sitting room, a family room in the modern sense, the room where the household actually lived when it was not performing. Ceilings run tall, 11 to 14 feet in the better examples. This is not luxury for its own sake. Hot air rises, and in a Charleston summer, you want the heat as far above your head as possible. Every inch of ceiling height is a degree of temperature relief. Now you know what this house looks like from the outside and the inside. Here is the question nobody asks next. Who decided it would work this way? And who paid the price for that decision? Nobody builds a house sideways by accident. Every architectural decision, no matter how organic it looks, no matter how much it seems to have simply grown out of the soil like something natural, is the product of pressure. Economic pressure, geographic pressure, the pressure of heat, of water, of land scarcity, of colonial ambition, of someone somewhere doing the math and deciding that this shape, this orientation, this particular arrangement of rooms and porches and doorways makes more sense than any other. The Charleston single house did not appear because a single genius architect sketched it one afternoon. It appeared because a specific set of conditions, a narrow peninsula, a punishing climate, an English land system, and a labor economy built on human bondage, made it the most logical response available. Pull on any one thread and the whole thing unravels into a story far more complicated than charming Southern architecture. So, let us pull. Start with the land itself, because the land explains almost everything. Charleston sits at the tip of a peninsula where the Ashley River and the Cooper River meet before emptying into the Atlantic. In 1720, a merchant named William Gibbies stood on a lot 27 feet wide and faced a decision that would shape every house on his street forever. Not a philosophical decision, a practical one. A wide house on a narrow lot is a contradiction. The lot wins. The house adapts. The English colonial government that established Charleston in 1670 had laid out a grid of long, narrow rectangles running perpendicular to the street. The logic was not architectural, it was administrative. More lots meant more property owners. More property owners meant more tax revenue, more political stability, more people with a financial stake in the colony's survival. The single-room width of the Charleston single house is not a stylistic choice. It is a geometric inevitability. Now, a significant portion of the English colonists who arrived in the Carolina colony in its earliest decades came not directly from England but from Barbados. They were second-generation Caribbean colonists, people who had already spent years building in brutal tropical heat, and they brought something more valuable than furniture or capital with them. They brought architectural instincts forged in a furnace. The wide veranda, the raised floor, the cross-ventilation logic, the understanding that in a subtropical climate the enemy is not cold, it is heat accumulation, humidity, and the diseases that breed in stagnant air and standing water. The Piazza is not a Charleston invention. Versions of it appear throughout the Caribbean plantation landscape. What Charleston did was adapt it, formalize it, stack it multiple stories high, orient it precisely toward the prevailing southwest wind, and make it the defining feature of an urban house type. The genius was not originality, it was translation, taking what worked in one hot place and making it work in another. Spend a summer in Charleston and you learn very quickly that not all directions are equal. The prevailing wind comes off the harbor from the southwest. On a still day, when the heat sits on the peninsula, like a weight, that southwest wind is the only moving air available. The families who built Charleston's finest single houses knew this the way farmers know which direction rain comes from. It was survival knowledge, not academic knowledge. The Piazza faces southwest, always. In street after street, block after block, the long side of the single house orients toward that harbor wind with the consistency of a compass needle finding north. This is not coincidence. This is planning. Tall ceilings let heat rise away from the bodies living below. Louvered shutters on the windows could be angled to catch moving air while blocking direct sunlight. The raised foundation, lifting the floor a half-story above grade, pulled cooler air from the shaded earth below the building. Every element of the design is doing climate work. Before electricity, before refrigeration, before any mechanical system whatsoever, these houses were managing heat through geometry alone. Climate logic explains the form. Economics explains the scale. Charleston in the early 19th century was one of the wealthiest cities in North America. The source of that wealth was cotton and rice, and the source of cotton and rice was enslaved labor on a massive scale. The finest single houses, the ones on South Battery and Laguerre Street that still stop pedestrians in their tracks, cost the equivalent of several $100,000 modern dollars to construct. Cypress woodwork, hand-plastered ceilings, custom-made mantels, iron hardware imported from England. Speculative builders also entered the picture. Investors would purchase a block of narrow lots and build 3 or 4 single houses in sequence, renting them to merchant families, lawyers, factors, the professional class that serviced the plantation economy without necessarily owning plantations themselves. The narrow lot turned out to be not just a climate solution but a rental income machine. The lot made the house narrow. The climate made it tall and porch-heavy. The money made it beautiful. And the labor that generated the money and the labor that built the house itself was, in most cases, not compensated. That is the foundation the Piazza sits on. Not just brick. Not just soil. Now pull back the Piazza, walk past the garden, go all the way to the rear of the lot. That is where the real story of this house type lives. Every house is a hierarchy. Not just in the obvious sense, not just in the way a mansion signals wealth and a shotgun shack signals poverty. Every house encodes in its very floor plan a theory about who matters, which entrance is grand and which is narrow, which rooms get the light and which get the leftovers, who moves through the front door and who moves through the back, who is meant to be seen inside these walls and who is meant to disappear into them. The Charleston single house operated on 3 distinct levels simultaneously: the family that owned it, the craftsmen who built it, and the people whose entire existence was organized around making sure the first group never had to think about the second. The families who commissioned and occupied Charleston single houses in the peak decades, roughly 1800 through 1860, were not, for the most part, the grandest names in South Carolina society. Those names built differently. The true plantation aristocracy had country seats, wide-fronted townhouses, and the kind of capital that does not need to economize on lot width. The single house was the home of the aspirational professional class: lawyers, factors, the merchants who brokered cotton and rice between the planters and the export markets, physicians, successful tradesmen who had accumulated enough to build permanently rather than rent. The middling sort, as historians call them, people with real money but not dynastic money, people for whom the house itself was a primary statement of having arrived. And what a statement it made. The Greek revival detailing that became fashionable in Enkiim, the 1820s, columns, pediments, classical cornices, was not arbitrary ornament. It was a deliberate visual vocabulary borrowed from ancient Athens and Rome and meant to communicate something very specific. We are educated people, we are civilized people, and our house proves it. This was architecture as credential. In a city where who you knew, what church you attended, which families you were connected to by blood or marriage determined your entire professional and social trajectory, the house was your most visible argument for belonging. The single house with its refined piazza and carefully maintained facade said, "We are serious, we are permanent." We are not going anywhere. Here is a name you will not find on most of the plaques outside Charleston's historic houses. The carpenters, bricklayers, plasterers, and ironworkers who actually constructed these buildings were, in a significant number of cases, African American. Many were free black artisans, skilled tradesmen who operated in a complicated legal and social space, technically free, but living under a web of restrictions that controlled where they could go, what work they could take, whom they could associate with. Others were enslaved men whose labor was hired out by their enslavers to contractors and builders who needed skilled hands, with the wages, when wages existed at all, flowing back not to the worker but to whoever claimed ownership over him. The technical knowledge required to hand plaster a ceiling, to lay a Flemish bond brick wall, to fabricate the wrought iron hardware that appears on Charleston's finest doorways. This knowledge lived primarily in black hands. It had been built up over generations, passed through apprenticeship systems that the historical record only partially captures. The men who built the piazzas never got to sit on them. Walk the full depth of a Charleston single-house lot and you pass through several distinct worlds. The main house first, formal, finished, presenting its best face to the piazza and through the piazza to whatever visitors were deemed worthy of admission. Then a formal garden, always functioning as a visual and physical buffer between the main structure and what came next. Then the rear buildings, a kitchen house, separate from the main structure, always, because cooking over open fire in a wooden building is not a risk any sensible person takes, and because the heat and smell of food preparation were considered incompatible with the refinement of the main rooms, and the quarters. Small structures, cramped, built to function, not to comfort, the people who lived in them, who cooked every meal consumed in the main house, who cleaned every room, who nursed every child, who maintained the gardens and the horses and the fireplaces and the entire invisible machinery that made gracious Charleston living possible, lived in these structures at the back of the lot, separated from the house they served by a garden that was itself a kind of border. The architecture enforced this separation deliberately. The service entrance was through the rear alley, not through the front gate. Domestic workers entered and exited from the back. Visitors and family entered from the street side and moved through the piazza. Two completely separate circulation systems operating within the same property, designed so that the daily labor of running the household would remain, as much as possible, out of the sightline of anyone seated on the piazza enjoying the breeze. Out of sight, out of mind, out of the story that the house was telling about itself. The Civil War ended legal enslavement. It did not immediately change the physical geography of the Charleston single-house lot. Freed people who had lived in the rear quarters found themselves in a new legal situation, but often the same physical one. The labor economy of domestic service continued, now nominally paid, often not fully, almost always structured to maintain the same hierarchies the architecture had encoded for decades. The kitchen house was still the kitchen house. The rear alley was still the rear alley. The main house still faced the garden, and the garden still separated the world of the family from the world of the people who kept it running. The walls did not change when the law did. And in Charleston, where the walls are old enough to remember everything, that matters. Stand in the formal parlor of a Charleston single house, tall ceilings, fine plasterwork, afternoon light coming through the louvered shutters, and it is genuinely beautiful. The proportions are right, the craftsmanship is real, the care that went into this room is visible in every detail. And then remember who made it possible to care about details. The family who commissioned the house brought the money, money generated by a plantation economy running on forced labor upcountry or by the legal and financial systems that service that economy in the city. The craftsmen who built it, many of them black, free or enslaved, brought the skill. The domestic workers who maintained it brought the daily labor that kept the whole performance running. The piazza catches the breeze. The garden looks beautiful. The rear yard held a completely different life. 3 groups, 1 property, 1 story that the architecture tells very carefully about one of them and works very hard to erase the other 2. That erasure was not accidental. It was part of the design. Nothing lasts the way it was built to last. Not empires, not economies, not the social systems that make certain kinds of houses possible, and not the houses themselves. By 1865, the conditions that had created the Charleston single house had either collapsed or cracked beyond repair. The plantation economy that had generated Charleston's antebellum wealth was gone. The cotton factors, the rice brokers, the lawyers whose practices had serviced the slave economy, their client base had either fled, died, or been financially obliterated by the war and its aftermath. Confederate bonds were worthless. Land values collapsed. The capital that had built the piazzas and the Greek Revival columns and the hand-plastered ceilings had evaporated. Maintenance on a Charleston single house was never cheap. In prosperous times, a household with domestic staff and sufficient income could keep pace with the constant small repairs that an old house demands. In the economic wreckage of Reconstruction, many families simply could not. Deferred maintenance is how houses begin to die. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally. A roof that leaks one season, a porch column that softens the next, a window frame that swells and never quite closes properly again. Charleston was already financially exhausted when the earthquake hit. On the evening of August 31, 1886, a magnitude 7.0 earthquake, one of the most powerful ever recorded in the eastern United States, struck the city. The damage was catastrophic. Hundreds of buildings were damaged or destroyed. Chimneys collapsed across the historic district. Walls cracked. Foundations shifted. The distinctive wrought iron earthquake bolts that you still see today, dotting the facades of Charleston's historic houses like metal stars and crosses and figure eights, are the visible remnants of the emergency structural reinforcement that property owners undertook in the aftermath. Long iron rods threaded through the building, anchored on exterior walls with decorative plates, pulling the structure back together from the outside. The earthquake bolts became unintentionally a kind of architectural badge, evidence of survival of a building that had been shaken and had not come down. Today they are considered charming. In 1886 they were emergency surgery. The early 20th century brought a different kind of pressure, not disaster, more like obsolescence. The buildings had been designed around an entirely different logic: outdoor privies, kitchen houses separated from the main, structure, water carried by hand. Modern life required different things of them, and the cost of transformation was real, for properties whose owners were already stretched, often prohibitive. The suburbs, spreading outward from the peninsula, offered wide lots and easy parking and new construction with every modern convenience already built in. For families who could afford to leave, the calculation was not difficult. The single houses they left behind became rental properties, boarding houses, subdivided apartments, a building designed for one household, one owner family and their domestic staff, was carved into 2 units, then 3, then sometimes more. Walls went up where doorways had been. Kitchens appeared in rooms that had been parlors. The elegant circulation logic of the original floor plan disappeared under decades of pragmatic adaptation. Here is one of American architectural history's great accidental ironies. The very poverty that accelerated the deterioration of many Charleston single houses also, paradoxically, saved them. In cities across America through the mid-20th century, prosperity was the enemy of historic architecture. Prosperous cities tore down old buildings and replaced them with new ones. Urban renewal programs, highway construction, and commercial redevelopment erased historic neighborhoods in Boston, Baltimore, New Orleans, and dozens of other American cities with startling speed. Charleston was too poor for most of this. The capital that would have funded large-scale demolition and redevelopment simply was not there. The developers who were reshaping other American cities looked at Charleston's peninsula and saw a market too small, too financially depressed, too complicated to bother with. The buildings stood, deteriorating, subdivided, poorly maintained, but standing, and standing turned out to be enough. In 1931, before the National Historic Preservation Act, before the National Register of Historic Places, before any federal framework for protecting old buildings existed, Charleston created America's first municipally designated historic district. The old and historic Charleston district imposed, for the first time anywhere in the country, design review requirements on exterior changes to buildings within its boundaries. The Board of Architectural Review that the ordinance created still exists today, still controls paint colors, window replacements, porch materials, and virtually every other exterior decision a property owner within the district can make. Then in 1947, the historic Charleston Foundation formed and began doing something more aggressive, buying deteriorated single houses, stabilizing them, and reselling them with deed restrictions that required the new owners to maintain the historic fabric. Houses that might have collapsed or been demolished were brought back into use and into the hands of people who were contractually obligated to care for them. The city had been too poor to destroy its past, and now it was building an entire economic identity around what that poverty had accidentally preserved. Saving the buildings cost something. The preservation apparatus, the historic district boundaries, the design review requirements, the deed restrictions, all of it created a framework that was extraordinarily effective at maintaining architectural character and extraordinarily effective at driving up property values. A house that the market had written off as a deteriorated liability in 1940 became, by 1980, a certified historic property in a designated district, exactly the kind of asset that wealthy buyers from outside Charleston wanted very much to own. Prices rose. The families who had survived in these buildings through the lean decades, many of them Black, many of them the descendants of the people who had maintained these houses as domestic workers a century earlier, found themselves in neighborhoods where the tax assessments and the cost of living were climbing past what they could sustain. The buildings were saved. The communities that had inhabited them during the long years of neglect were not. Preservation had arrived, and it brought displacement with it. Charleston knows how to tell a story about itself. It has been practicing for centuries. The story goes something like this: a gracious city, a refined city, a city that understood beauty and proportion and the art of living well, a city of piazzas and gardens and the soft clink of sweet tea glasses on a hot afternoon. It is a good story. Parts of it are even true. But a story is also always a selection, and what gets left out of Charleston's official story about itself, what gets edited quietly from the tour script, softened in the preservation literature, cropped out of the real estate photography, is the part that makes the beauty make sense. Open any Charleston tourism brochure from the last 50 years, and the phrase appears in some variation on nearly every page. Southern gentility, gracious living, timeless elegance. The language of a lifestyle so refined, so considered, so aesthetically perfected that it seems almost to have arrived fully formed, like something that simply grew from the soil. What the phrase is doing, what it has always been doing, is aestheticizing a specific economic system without naming it. The gracious living of the antebellum Charleston single house was not self-generating. It required a cook, a laundress, a nursemaid for the children, and a dozen other people performing daily labor that was never counted in the ledger of elegance. In a city where the majority of domestic workers were enslaved, gracious living was another way of describing what it looked like to be the beneficiary of forced labor. The piazza where the family caught the evening breeze was possible because someone else was in the kitchen house at the rear of the lot in the August heat, cooking over an open fire. The entire aesthetic, the thing that makes people fly to Charleston today and walk the streets feeling nostalgic for something they never actually experienced, was built on a foundation that the language of Southern gentility was specifically designed to obscure. Now bring it forward. Charleston's historic preservation movement is, by any objective measure, one of the most successful in American history. The buildings are extraordinary. The streetscapes are intact in ways that comparable American cities can only envy. The craftsmanship that survived, the plasterwork, the ironwork, the cypress millwork, is genuinely irreplaceable. But ask who was displaced in the process. The neighborhoods that preservation saved in the mid-20th century were, before they were saved, inhabited largely by Black Charleston residents and working-class families who had lived in these buildings through the long decades of neglect. They were not the target demographic of the historic Charleston Foundation's revolving fund or the Architectural Review Board's design standards. They were people who had found affordable housing in buildings that the market had written off, and when preservation made those buildings desirable again, the market came back for them. A single house on the Lower Peninsula, the same building type that was a deteriorated boarding house in 1950, lists today between $900,000 and $2 million, depending on condition and location. The Airbnb economy has accelerated this further, converting residential units into tourist accommodation and removing them from the long-term housing supply entirely. The people whose ancestors built these houses, whose ancestors maintained them, whose ancestors lived in the rear quarters that have since been converted into charming garden cottages for the real estate listing, are largely not the people who own them now. Here is the image to hold. A Charleston single house on a sunny morning, the piazza gleaming white. A real estate photographer's drone shot capturing the garden, the restored ironwork gate, the original heart pine floors, glimpsed through the open shutters. The listing describes it as a rare opportunity to own a piece of Charleston's living history. The asking price is $1.4 million. The kitchen house at the rear has been converted to a guest suite. The alley behind the property, where domestic workers once entered and exited invisibly, is now a charming pedestrian lane featured in food and travel magazines. The house is beautiful. The craftsmanship is real. The history is genuine. And the history is also this: the people who built it did not choose to. The people who maintained it did not benefit from it. The people who preserved it, with the best of intentions, made it unaffordable to the communities most directly descended from its original labor force. Some buildings just hold the past. They sit there, solid and quiet, and the past lives inside them the way water lives inside stone, not visible, not moving, but present in every grain. Walk past a Charleston single house on a Tuesday afternoon, nothing special happening, just the light coming through the live oaks and the piazza sitting empty in the heat, and the whole weight of what you now know comes with it: the narrow lot, the southwest wind, The Greek revival columns that said we have arrived, the earthquake bolts still visible on the facade like old stitches on a healed wound. The kitchen house converted to a guest suite. All of it still there. All of it still speaking. Charleston is currently fighting several arguments at once, and every one of them runs through these houses. The first is about housing. The historic district's preservation rules, the same rules that save the buildings, make new supply almost impossible. The result is a city whose most desirable neighborhoods are effectively frozen, where demand keeps climbing and supply cannot respond, and where the people who cannot afford $1.4 million for a single house are pushed further and further from the peninsula. Preservationists argue, not without reason, that destroying historic fabric to build market-rate units is a trade that only looks good on a spreadsheet. Housing advocates argue, not without reason, that a preservation framework that protects buildings while displacing people has confused the means for the end. Both arguments are correct. That is what makes it a real problem. The second argument is about short-term rentals. Airbnb and its competitors have converted a significant number of single houses from residential homes into tourist accommodation, extracting revenue from the historic character of the neighborhood while quietly removing units from the long-term housing market. The city has passed regulations. The regulations have been contested. The conversion continues. The third argument, quieter, slower, but underneath everything else, is about whose heritage is actually being preserved and who gets to say. The buildings are protected. The stories attached to them are still, largely, the comfortable ones. The rear quarters get listed as charming outbuildings. The craftsmen who built the piazzas remain unnamed on the plaques. The domestic workers who made the lifestyle possible appear, if at all, in the passive voice. Come back to the street where we started. Same cobblestones, same Spanish moss, same narrow facades presenting their sliver of face to the world, while the real life of the building, the piazza, the garden, the complicated rear yard, extends back out of sight. The house has not changed. You have. That is what architecture does when you learn to read it properly. It stops being scenery and starts being evidence. Evidence of decisions made about land and labor and power, and who gets to be visible and who gets designed out of the frame. The Charleston single house faces sideways. It always has. Narrow end to the street, real face turned away, door opening onto a porch that catches the wind from the harbor. For 2.5 centuries, it has been standing exactly like that, turned slightly away from the world, holding its history close, letting you see just enough to think you understand it. You have to go around the side to get the full picture. Most people never do.